There's one more thing about hooks that I want to cover, and that is writing reusable custom hooks yourself. Now, I know it seems kind of complicated, but it's actually really easy. But we have to first explore why we would want to do such a thing. So inside of our test application, what we have are these two components. One is a user component and one is a post component. What you pass each of these components is an ID, which we will then use to fetch against our JSON placeholder API that we've been using to see whether or not the user or the post exists. If the user exists, we'll display the name and the username, and if the post exists, we'll show the title and the body. Now, if they don't exist, what we'll do is we'll just show this text, user not found or post not found. And the code is pretty simple in terms of how we're rendering it. We just need to actually figure out how to get our user using the user ID we pass into our user component. And our post is going to be similarly the same thing. Now, one of the hunches that we get when we write this code is that we'll probably end up writing very similar code. But let's just write it for practice's sake so that we can flesh it out and see what we got to do. Before we write our custom hook, let's just write the independent solutions to create what we need inside of our respective components. Now, we probably will need our useState hook and our useEffect hook, as we're most commonly used to using them by now. And what we're going to do is we are going to get a post and also a set post from this useState hook, where our default object will be null because we're going to get back an object. Now, what we want to do in our useEffect hook is we will pass in this function, and then we're going to do our async pattern, as we remember, where we write the actual async function inside of our function. So we'll call it fetch post equals async function. And what it does is inside we are going to get a const of our response back from our fetch, and then we're going to pass in our URL. So let's go to our JSON placeholder URL here, and let's just go to our posts. So we know what we need is we need to go to this URL, and we are going to say we want the post where the ID goes to the actual ID that we're going to pass to it. So we'll say post ID right here, right, using our string interpolation. So there's nothing too new here. We just have to make sure to await for this, as well as set our const fetch post. And then we're going to say const posts will be equal to our await call of our res.json. And as we remember, when we fetch it from a URL like this with our JSON placeholder, we'll get back an array, right, where this ID matches the post ID. But because we know where our IDs are going to be unique, we'll, of course, always get the first one. So it'll be easy for us then to just say something like set post equal to posts at 0. If this is the case, right, if we have something inside of our array, then this will be the object that gets set to our post. If there's nothing, then we'll just get undefined, which is still fine for us. And then we got to make sure to call our fetch post. And then once we save, we will now see at least that we are fetching our post, right? Because the ID we actually have inside of our app.js being passed in right here. So we're bringing in our post and we're passing a post ID of 15. The same we got to apply for our user ID. So let's write the same code. We know we are going to use state and use effect. And we know that we're going to get a user and set user, which equals our use state, again with a default value of null. And then we're going to call our use effect and do something very similar. Fetch user equals an async function, where we'll get our response from our fetch, Except this time, instead of posts, we're going to fetch users. And we're going to pass an ID equal to our user ID. Similarly, we're going to get users, which equals our, gotta await this call. We gotta await for our response.json. And then we'll call setUser on our users at 0. And then we call fetchUser. And now we'll see that we should be getting our user. String interpolation. Whoops. So I was using the wrong type of string. There we go. So here we see we're able to get our code. We're able to get the object of the user for user 5 or 15 if they exist. But if we look at this code, between this code and our post code, we'll actually see that it's pretty much the same code that we're writing. It's just that one is setting posts and one is setting users. So what we can do here is we can move this into a reusable effect that we can bring into our components. So let's do it like this. In order for us to write this, we have to make a new folder. We're going to call it effects. And inside of our effects folder, we're going to make a new effect called useFetch. So the thing about our effects, if they're custom, is that they always must use the syntax of use and then the functionality. So for us, we're trying to use our fetch, so we're going to call it useFetch. And this is just the naming practice that the React team wants us to follow. So we'll just do usefetch.effect.js so that we know it's an effect. And inside, what we're going to do is we're pretty much going to import in what we had before. Except we're going to modify this code so that it's reusable. What we'll say is we will bring in our useState and our useEffect from React. And then we're going to make a function that we're going to call useFetch. Now, because we're not passing in a specific ID, we're going to get the ID from our component, we instead are going to pass a whole URL that we're going to call our fetch on. And then inside, we're going to duplicate this code that we have here, except we're going to make it more generic. So instead of user, we're probably going to use a generic data, and we're going to set data. And then useState is the same because we still want to end up with one object. Now, instead of fetch user, we're going to call it fetch data. And then instead of manually passing in and string interpolating this URL, we're going to get the URL from our function anyways. So that's the great thing about these custom effects that we write. We can send in any number of parameters because all we're writing is a function. We're just leveraging a function that has leverage to these hooks because, as we remember, our functional components are also functions, and hooks function inside of functions. So that's why we're able to just write functions however we are, but then leverage the existing code that we need. In fact, we don't even have to use this function syntax. We can completely write our code like we normally would with our arrow functions. It's entirely up to you. It's very flexible. So we'll say useFetch, we'll pass in the URL, we'll get this URL, we'll get the response, and then we know that what we'll have is a data array, right? Because of what we're fetching from. So if we knew that if we wanted to make a more generic one for fetching any URL, right, we can do that too. But in our case, we know we'll always end up getting an array because of the URLs that we're using in our application. And now we have pretty much completed this effect inside. And we just got to make sure that from this useFetch, what we're returning is the data that we finished fetching. And now if we save and export this out, we can bring this effect now into our components. We're just going to import in our useEffect from effects, useEffect. And now what we do in order to use it is we set const user equal to our useEffect. And now this pretty much is how we are going to use it. Oh, whoops. Use fetch. Sorry. I named that wrong. There we go. So let's just pass this here. Okay. A little mistake in naming conventions. We can remove these now because we're no longer using them. We're using our custom effect. And we'll see that our user still works. We refresh. We see that we got our flash of our message if there was no user. And we'll pull in our user once it comes in. And all our code still works the same. So our useFetch hook is now reusable here. And you can imagine, similarly, it will be the same thing inside of our post component. So let's just import that again. Our useFetch from effects, useFetch effect. We'll just copy our URL. And we'll set const post equals useFetch on our URL. And now we see both our code works. We don't need this import anymore either. And we've now got this reusable fetch inside of our components. So simply, it's just like writing utility functions, right? We're just extrapolating out these effects that we see are reusable and then compose them into these reusable effects that we can bring into our components. So very handy. This is the great thing about writing our own hooks. Now, of course, this can be done in any way we want, right? We can use these effect hooks and these useState hooks, right? As well as the other hooks that are a little bit more obscure in the React hook world to build our own custom hooks. And we're able to now extrapolate out reusable code in our components and share them across our components, which is the big advantage of writing hooks. Once you start writing hooks in a certain way for your applications, you start thinking about what parts of my components can share the same functionality. And then you end up just making custom hooks that will share that for you. So hopefully this is a good introduction to what the potential for hooks can be. And again, at the point of this time, hooks are still a pretty new technology. So there's a lot that you can do with it, right? It's really just a tool. And different companies and different projects you join may end up using these tools in completely different ways. As of yet, there's not that many best practices other than what the React hooks documentation suggests, which I definitely suggest you take a look at as well, especially if you want to see some of the other hooks that are available to us. Now, there will definitely be projects where you join where they may not want to use hooks at all because the existing ecosystem works for them, right? And if you've been on a project for 3 years that's been built using the React, Redux, Saga, or whatever library combination of the React project, it might not make sense to suddenly migrate your entire application over to using hooks if you've been using class components perfectly fine. Again, it all comes down to the project that you join and the team that you join, as well as the business goals of the companies that you end up working with. But it's good to know what tools you have available in case the team you join does eventually one day want to migrate slowly over to hooks, or they want to write the code that they write from now on in hooks. So having knowledge of it is good. Okay, now let's move forward with our course.